Madrid, a city of endless movement, where the streets whisper forgotten stories and history lingers in the air like the scent of old parchment. The Plaza Mayor, with its grand arches and silent witnesses of the past, has seen centuries of life and death unfold within its confines. Tourists snap photos of the bronze statue of King Philip III, oblivious to the deeper secrets buried beneath the cobblestone square. But for those who live in Madrid long enough, there are places where the air feels heavier, where the past clings to the present in ways that defy explanation. It was a chilly autumn evening when I first noticed him, the man in the dark coat, standing perfectly still beneath one of the lamplights in the plaza. He was neither blending into the crowd nor drawing attention to himself. It was as if he existed in a space between the two, watching but never participating. At first, I assumed he was waiting for someone, a lost tourist perhaps, or an old man catching his breath after a long walk. But as I passed him on my way home, something in his expression unsettled me. His eyes, dark and unblinking, followed my every step. I turned the corner, quickening my pace, and yet a strange sensation crawled up my spine. The feeling that I was still being watched. When I glanced back, he was no longer under the lamplight. Instead, he stood directly across the street from me, though I had never heard him move. A shiver gripped my body, and I hurried through the winding streets of La Latina, determined to shake off the irrational fear that gnawed at me. By the time I reached my apartment, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Madrid was a city full of strange characters, eccentric artists, beggars, late-night drunks. I had likely fixated on a coincidence. But as I set my keys on the table and glanced out my window, my blood ran cold. Across the street, in the dim glow of a street lamp, the stranger stood once more. Still, watching. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every distant honk of a car, made me jolt awake. But by morning, the rational part of my mind took over. He was gone. The city was back to normal, and the Plaza Mayor was once again filled with street performers and vendors. I even laughed at myself over breakfast, amused at how paranoia had twisted my perception. Days passed without incident. I told myself I had let my imagination run wild, and for a while, I believed it. But then, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as I sat reading in a cafe near Puerta del Sol, I saw him again. Sitting at a table near the entrance, his posture rigid, his hands resting motionless on the surface. His gaze never met mine, but I knew he was aware of me. I forced myself to ignore him, sipping my coffee as if nothing was wrong. But my hands shook. My pulse raced. I paid for my drink and stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air, determined to break the spell this man seemed to have over me. Yet as I merged into the crowd, a deep and terrible certainty formed in my gut. I was not the one who had noticed him. He had noticed me first. Madrid is an old city, built on layers of forgotten lives. Beneath its streets lie tunnels older than memory, catacombs where secrets rot in the damp darkness. As I walked past the Catedral de la Almudena, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something beyond my understanding. The man in the dark coat was no ordinary stranger. He was something else, and I feared I was about to find out what. Madrid has always been a city of contradictions, a place where the ancient and the modern exist side by side, where history refuses to be silenced by the hum of traffic and the neon glow of advertisements. I had lived here long enough to understand that some things are better left unexplored, that certain corners of the city carry whispers meant to be ignored. But ignoring something does not make it disappear. And I was beginning to realize that the stranger in the dark coat was not going to disappear. I had seen him twice now, and though I told myself it was coincidence, I knew better. It was not the seeing that disturbed me. It was the feeling, the cold, invasive sensation of being watched, as though an unseen thread connected me to something just beyond my understanding. I had spent years in Madrid without ever experiencing fear like this, but now it had settled into my bones. The following evening, I made a decision. I would return to Plaza Mayor. I had to prove to myself that the stranger was nothing more than a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind born from fatigue and paranoia. The square was alive with its usual energy. Tourists clutched their cameras, street performers danced for coins, and vendors peddled their souvenirs. I walked slowly, deliberately, scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. I let out a breath of relief. Perhaps I had been wrong. Perhaps I had let my fears spiral into something absurd. But just as I turned to leave, my body froze. A shadow moved, detached itself from the wall of one of the surrounding buildings, and stepped into the light. He was there. The stranger stood across the plaza, motionless, his dark coat blending into the twilight. He did not move toward me. He did not speak. He simply stood, a silent presence against the backdrop of a city that continued as if he did not exist. My heart pounded. My skin prickled with cold sweat, but I refused to run. I would not give in to fear. Then, in an instant, he was gone. Not lost in the crowd. Not obscured by movement. Gone, as if he had never been there at all. I blinked, scanning the plaza, my breath coming in short gasps. It was impossible. No man could vanish like that. No man could stand in one place and simply cease to be. I walked home in a daze, my thoughts unraveling into a tangled mess of fear and disbelief. The streets felt different now, emptier, quieter, as if the city itself was holding its breath. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me, my fingers trembling against the metal. That night, I dreamt of footsteps echoing through empty streets, of a shadow that moved without sound, of eyes that watched from a place just beyond sight. When I awoke, drenched in sweat, the feeling of being watched had not left me. And when I looked toward my window, I knew why. The man in the dark coat was standing across the street, watching, waiting. Madrid may be a city of contradictions, but one truth had become painfully clear. Whatever was following me was no longer bound by logic. And it was not going to stop. Madrid's streets, so familiar to me, now felt like a labyrinth I could not escape. Every alleyway, every plaza, every reflection in a shop window seemed to hold something just out of sight. The city had not changed, but I had, or rather, something had changed around me. The stranger in the dark coat was no longer a fleeting vision. He was a presence, constant, unwavering. I saw him in passing glances through metro windows, standing too still in the reflection of a cafe door, lingering in the periphery of my vision before dissolving into the shifting crowds. I never saw him move. That was the worst part. He was always there, but never in the act of arriving, as if he did not belong to the ordinary flow of time. Desperation took hold of me after yet another sleepless night. The feeling of being watched had burrowed into my skin, and I knew I could not live like this. If I could not run, I would confront it. And so, I did something I had not done in years. I sought out someone who understood Madrid's other side. Maria del Sol was an old acquaintance, an urban historian who specialized in Madrid's forgotten spaces. She had spent years documenting the city's underground tunnels, abandoned buildings, and eerie folklore. If anyone could give me an answer, it was her. I found her in a quiet bar near Malesana, drinking wine with the nonchalance of someone who had seen too much and survived it anyway. When I described the man in the dark coat, Maria did not laugh. She did not dismiss my paranoia. Instead, she took a slow sip of her drink and asked me one simple question. "Where was the first place you saw him?" "Plaza Mayor," I told her, but that was not what she wanted to know. "Where exactly did you first feel the fear?" I paused, the memory unraveling. The man had unsettled me in the plaza, but the fear, the deep, undeniable fear, had gripped me when I saw him from my apartment window. Maria's expression darkened. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded map of Madrid, yellowed with age. Her finger traced the streets, stopping at a name that sent a chill through my spine. Calle del Pez. My street. My home. "There is an apartment there," she murmured. "An apartment that does not belong." I swallowed, suddenly unsure if I wanted to know more. Maria continued, her voice low, deliberate. "There are old buildings in Madrid that shift. Places that appear normal but aren't. The city is built on layers. Of history, of tragedy, of things that should have been erased but weren't. Some apartments get lost. Forgotten. and sometimes something stays behind. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that this was absurd, but deep down I knew. The feeling had started in my home, in the place where I was supposed to be safe. "Don't go back," Maria warned. "Not tonight." But where else could I go? Madrid was a city now, and something told me that no matter where I ran, he would always find me. Madrid had never felt so unfamiliar. The streets, once vibrant and full of life, had turned into something else, a shifting maze where shadows stretched too far, where familiar landmarks seemed slightly out of place, as if reality itself were slipping. The stranger in the dark coat had turned my world into a waking nightmare, but Maria's words haunted me even more. There is an apartment there, an apartment that does not belong. I should have listened to her. I should have found a hotel, or a friend's couch, or even a bench in Retiro Park to spend the night. But fear does strange things to the mind. It does not always push you to escape. It can also pull you toward the thing you fear most. And so, I found myself walking back to Calle del Pez, my hands trembling inside my jacket pockets. The street was quiet, too quiet for Madrid. The usual sounds, laughter from late-night bars, the hum of passing cars, the distant chatter of pedestrians were gone. It was as if the city had momentarily held its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I reached my apartment building, I hesitated. The lights in the hallway flickered as I stepped inside, casting the walls in erratic bursts of shadow. The elevator was out of order again, so I took the stairs, my footsteps echoing against the old tiles. By the time I reached my door, a deep sense of unease had settled in my chest. The air was different, thick, Ron. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but before I could turn it, I noticed something. The number on my apartment door, 3B, looked off. It was the same brass plate as always, but something about it felt misplaced, as if it had been moved a fraction of an inch to the left. My fingers traced the edges of the metal, and my breath caught in my throat. There was another number underneath, a faded 2C, barely visible beneath the fresh coat of paint. My heart pounded. That didn't make sense. There had never been a 2C in this building. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how silent everything was. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and uneven, but nothing else. No neighbors, no distant televisions, not even the city outside. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment looked the same at first. My furniture, my books, my half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter. But something was different. The dimensions felt off. The walls seemed slightly wider, the ceiling slightly higher. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. I turned on the light, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, where my bedroom door should have been, there was another door, one that had never been there before. It was old, older than the rest of the apartment. The wood was warped and blackened, the paint cracked and peeling. A single brass handle gleamed dully in the dim light. A deep, suffocating dread filled my lungs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move, because for the first time since I had stepped inside, I finally heard something. From the other side of the door, something knocked. Once, twice. Then, in a voice that was almost mine, someone whispered my name. Madrid, for all its centuries of history, had always been a city of hidden stories, tales woven into its cobbled streets, lost in the depths of its underground tunnels, whispered in the dead of night by those who dared to listen. But as I stood in my own apartment, staring at a door that should not have been there, I realized I had become part of one of those stories. The knock echoed in my bones. It was soft, deliberate, but filled with an unnatural weight, as though the very air in the room had thickened with its sound. Worse than the knock was the voice that followed. My name, my own name, spoken just wrong enough to send a sharp current of fear through me. I did not answer. Instead, I took a slow, hesitant step backward, as if movement alone could somehow undo the reality in front of me. The lights flickered, and I felt a shift in the room, an almost imperceptible displacement, as though the very walls of my apartment had breathed. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against my skin. I had to leave. Now, with every ounce of willpower, I forced myself to move, to turn, to reach for the doorknob that led to the real world. But as my fingers closed around the metal, the knock came again. Louder, more insistent. This time, the voice that followed was clearer. "You've been here before?" A chill shot down my spine. No, that was impossible. I had never seen this door before in my life. The handle of the door, my door, the one that should lead to safety, was ice cold under my grip. I twisted it sharply, yanking the door open, ready to flee. But the hallway outside was wrong. The flickering lights had dimmed to a dull, sepulchral glow, casting the walls in a sickly, yellowed hue. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, impossibly so, its tiled floor warping into a distorted corridor that should not have fit within the building's layout. This was not my building anymore. Panic clawed at my throat. My only option was the stairwell. I turned and ran, my footsteps sounding muffled against the floor. The air was thick, pressing against me, slowing me down. I reached the stairs and they weren't there. Where the stairwell should have been was nothing but a solid wall. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned, frantically searching for another way out. The elevator? Gone. The hallway behind me? Changing, stretching, the doors along its shifting positions as if the building itself were alive. A slow creaking sound pulled my attention back to the apartment. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that shouldn't exist, was opening. A sliver of darkness leaked from within, too dark, like an absence of space itself. And then movement, a shadow shifting behind it, something just beyond the threshold. My own breath turned to ice in my lungs. Then, finally I saw him. The man in the dark coat. Not outside, not watching from afar. He was here, standing just past the doorframe, his silhouette impossibly still, his face obscured in the unnatural blackness. He did not move, but I felt the weight of his gaze. I felt it burrow into my mind, peeling apart my memories, my thoughts, my very sense of self. And then, in a voice that was unmistakably my own, he spoke. "Welcome home." Madrid had always been a city of echoes, voices bouncing off alley walls, stories repeating through time, ghosts lingering in the spaces where history refused to fade. But this was something else. This was not an echo. This was a voice that should not exist, speaking in a tone that was unmistakably mine. The man in the dark coat did not move. He stood just beyond the threshold of the impossible door, his presence more than physical, as if his very being bent the space around him. The blackness behind him wasn't the absence of light. It was an absence of everything. I wanted to run, but my feet refused to move. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse thundering in my ears. The hallway around me continued to shift, stretching, distorting. Reality was unraveling. "What do you want?" My voice cracked as I finally spoke, though I wasn't sure I had actually formed the words aloud. The man tilted his head, as if considering the question. Then he took a single step forward. It was small, slow, unthreatening in theory, but the weight of it sent an unnatural pressure through the air, as if the very fabric of space shuddered beneath his movement. "You already know," he said. I didn't, or maybe I did, but I was afraid to admit it. The moment stretched impossibly long. My mind raced through options, none of them good. I could run, but to where? There was no exit. I could fight, but against what? The rules of reality no longer applied. Then I noticed something. My apartment, the one I had just fled from, was different now. The walls, the furniture, the objects scattered across the countertops, they were not quite right. A mirror version of what they should be. My books were stacked differently. The coffee cup was on the wrong side of the counter, and the paintings on the wall were inverted, like a reflection in glass. I turned back toward the man in the dark coat. Understanding clawed its way into my mind like ice. This wasn't my apartment. This was something else pretending to be it. "This is a mistake," I whispered. For the first time, the man smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a movement that didn't quite belong on a human face. "No," he said. "You made the mistake." And then, before I could react, the lights flickered violently, the walls trembled, and the door behind him, the impossible door, slammed shut. The moment it closed, the world around me collapsed into darkness. When the darkness swallowed me, It did so completely. Not the kind of darkness found in the quiet of a bedroom at night, nor even the kind lurking in the depths of an unlit alley. This was absolute. It was the absence of time, of movement, of even the weight of my own body. I had no sense of falling, no sensation at all, just the vast, endless black stretching in every direction. Then, suddenly I was somewhere else. I landed hard, my body collapsing onto a cold, wet surface. The impact forced the air from my lungs, and I coughed violently, the taste of something metallic filling my mouth. My fingers dug into the ground beneath me. It was stone, rough and uneven, slick with moisture. A dim, sickly light flickered above me. I turned my head and realized I was in an alleyway. But not just any alleyway. It looked like Madrid, but it wasn't. The buildings loomed too tall, their windows dark and empty, like hollowed-out eyes watching from above. The street was narrow, twisted at angles that should not have been possible. The air was thick with a damp, decayed smell. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of here. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. Every instinct in my body screamed that I was not supposed to be in this place, that I had been pulled into something I could not understand. Footsteps echoed in the distance. Slow, measured. I turned sharply, scanning the shadows. The alley stretched longer than it should have, curving unnaturally in the distance. A figure stood at the far end, just out of reach of the dim light. I knew, before my eyes even fully adjusted, who it was. The man in the dark coat. He had not chased me. He had not even moved. Yet here he was, waiting, as if he had known exactly where I would appear. "You brought yourself here," his voice echoed, though his lips never moved. I backed away instinctively, my mind racing for an escape. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I had to find something familiar, something grounded in the Madrid I knew. I turned sharply and ran in the opposite direction, my feet pounding against the slick stone. The city twisted around me. I should have emerged onto one of Madrid's main streets, maybe Gran Via or Calle de Alcalá, but instead, I found myself in another alley, then another, each one identical, looping back in on itself, leading nowhere. I was trapped. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as I spun around, searching for anything that made sense. My own fear was turning to something worse now, the terrible realization that I was somewhere I might never escape from. And then the whisper came, right next to my ear. "You never left." I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Only the twisted streets of a city that was no longer Madrid. The whisper lingered in the air long after it had passed, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. I had never left? What did that mean? I was still in Madrid, wasn't I? The alleys, the ancient stone streets, the flickering glow of distant street lamps. It all seemed familiar. But familiarity was no longer a comfort. It was a trap, a mask stretched over something else entirely. I took a cautious step forward, my shoes slick against the damp pavement. The air was wrong, not just thick with moisture, but heavy, pressing against me, as though unseen hands were reaching from the walls, brushing against my skin. The buildings, so tall they seemed to swallow the sky, leaned inward as if conspiring to keep me enclosed. I had never felt so watched, and yet there was no one. No one except him. The man in the dark coat was still there, standing in the distance at the end of yet another alley, impossibly still. His presence seemed to bend the space around him, as though Madrid itself recoiled from him. I refused to let my gaze linger too long. I had to move. I had to find a way out. I turned sharply and walked in the opposite direction, resisting the urge to run. Running felt dangerous, like it would trigger something lurking beneath the surface of this place. Instead, I focused on my breathing, on my footsteps on the streets ahead. That was when I noticed the windows. Every building had windows, old, shuttered, glassless in some places, but now I saw them for what they really were. They were eyes. Some were dark and hollow, but others blinked. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse thundering. The windows shifted as I stared, black voids turning inward, rolling in their sockets, following my every movement. Madrid was watching me. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the alley, a vibration in the stone beneath my feet, like the city itself was breathing. The light from the distant street lamps flickered erratically, casting shadows that did not belong to me. I was not alone. A whisper slithered through the darkness, weaving through the alleyways like a wind that carried no air. This time, it did not come from behind me. It came from everywhere. 1,000 voices speaking in unison, overlapping, impossible to distinguish. "We see you." I staggered backward, my breath catching in my throat. The walls groaned as if they were shifting, as if they had only been pretending to be stone this entire time. I turned, ready to run, but the alley had changed again. The street ahead of me was no longer made of stone. It was made of faces, mouths frozen mid-scream, eyes wide, staring, bulging in terror, skin twisted into grotesque patterns, as if Madrid had swallowed its own people whole and made them part of itself. And at the very center of this nightmare stood the man in the dark coat, his expression unchanged, as though none of this surprised him, as though he had been expecting me to see it all eventually. Madrid had never been a city, not in the way I had always thought. Madrid was no longer a city. It was a living, breathing thing, a predator that had been waiting for me to notice. The streets writhed beneath my feet. The buildings pulsed like organs beneath flickering lamplight, and the air itself carried a sound I could no longer mistake for the wind. It was breathing. I didn't dare move at first. Every instinct screamed that any sudden motion might trigger something far worse. And yet, I couldn't stay. The ground beneath me was shifting, the faces trapped in the stone stretching, their mouths widening as if trying to scream, to warn me, to consume me. I forced my legs to move. One step, another. The cobblestone faces beneath my shoes groaned as I pressed forward, their bulging eyes watching me as I walked. I focused on the alley ahead, trying not to look at the man in the dark coat, trying not to acknowledge that he was still standing there, waiting, as if my terror was merely part of his plan. The city had been changing all along, warping around me in ways I hadn't noticed until now. The streets I had once known, the crowded sidewalks, the cafes spilling over with conversation, the neon glow of storefronts, were gone. What remained was a hollow, decayed version of Madrid, something ancient, something that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. I turned a corner, hoping, praying, that I might find some semblance of the real world waiting for me. Instead, I was met with a street that should not have existed. It was empty, not just devoid of people, but devoid of time, of sound, of movement. The buildings loomed taller than before, stretching toward a sky that had darkened into something unnatural. No stars, no moon, just an endless, ink-black abyss. And then, the whispering began again. At first, it was distant, a murmuring wind slipping between the cracks of the buildings. But then, it grew closer, voices overlapping, rising and falling, speaking words I could almost understand but not quite. He walks where he should not. He does not belong. Madrid knows him now. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The words were inside my head, inside my bones. My knees nearly buckled, but I forced myself to keep walking. That was when I saw them. Figures emerging from the buildings, stepping out of the walls as though they had always been part of them. Their faces were wrong. Some were blurred, shifting, unformed. Others were too familiar, people I had seen on the metro, in cafes, on street corners, faces I should not have remembered but did. And they were all staring at me. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged. The whispering intensified, rising into a chorus of voices that no longer spoke. They chanted. The buildings trembled, the ground beneath me cracking, the faces in the stone stretching into expressions of agony. I turned to run, but standing in front of me, blocking my path, was the man in the dark coat. He did not move. He did not speak. But somehow, I knew exactly what he wanted. I had to listen. The air around me seemed to still, as if the city itself held its breath in the face of something inevitable. I had no way to explain it, but there was a suffocating certainty that whatever was about to happen, it was not something I could outrun. The man in the dark coat stood still in front of me, his presence both immovable and inevitable. He was a barrier, not just of flesh, but of purpose. And that purpose was something far darker than anything I had encountered before. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask questions, to demand answers. But my voice felt trapped, like the words themselves were afraid to leave my throat. The weight of the silence pressed in on me, unbearable. The whispering had died down, but it had not stopped. It was now in my mind, a constant hum beneath my thoughts. It wasn't just the city watching me anymore. It was something else. A sharp breath escaped me as I forced myself to look into the face of the man before me. His eyes were dark, black, deep pools that seemed to absorb the dim light around us. They were the eyes of someone who had seen eternity, or perhaps someone who had become part of it. I couldn't tell which, but in that moment I understood. He was not a person anymore. The realization hit me like a jolt of ice-cold water. He was something else, something beyond human. A guardian, perhaps, but of what? A sentinel standing watch over a city that no longer existed? Or was he simply a harbinger of the inevitable? I couldn't decide. "You can't escape this." The man finally spoke, his voice as cold as the stone that seemed to seep from the walls around us. His words were not a warning, but a statement of fact. A cruel certainty. I wanted to shout, to scream that this was all wrong, that this couldn't be happening. But instead, the words died in my throat. He was right. No matter how much I wanted to fight it, to return to the familiar world I had known, there was no going back. Madrid had become something else entirely, a reflection of everything that had been lost. The whispering returned, louder now, echoing in my ears as though the very streets themselves were speaking. "He knows. He will understand. It is too late." I stumbled backward, my feet dragging against the uneven cobblestones. The city shifted again, the walls around me twisting and contracting as if trying to reach out, to pull me into its fold. I turned desperately, searching for a way out, but there was none. No escape. The alleys had closed in. The sky above had darkened into an endless void, and the streets had turned into a labyrinth that had no beginning and no end. I was trapped. But then, in the midst of that suffocating darkness, I saw something. A light. It was small, distant, but undeniably real. A flicker of warmth in a place that had become cold and unfeeling. I turned toward it instinctively, a part of me clinging to the hope that it was the way out, that it was a glimpse of the world I had known, a world that still existed beyond this nightmare. As I moved toward it, the man in the dark coat did not follow. He remained where he stood, his presence a constant weight behind me. The light grew brighter, clearer, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I might have found it. The edge of the abyss. The escape. But then the city spoke once more. "You will not leave. Not without understanding." The ground beneath me cracked. The light flickered, and I knew, with an unbearable certainty, that whatever path I was on, I was not the one in control. Madrid had made its choice. I stood before the flickering light, my heart pounding in my chest. For a fleeting moment, it was the only thing that made sense. The darkness, the twisted city, the shadows that whispered. I was desperate to escape it all. But now, as I inched closer to the light, something gnawed at me, something deep within, telling me that this wasn't just an escape. It was a choice I didn't fully understand. The light was no longer just a light. It was a gateway, a door carved into the fabric of the city itself. It pulsed with energy, with a warmth that promised solace. Yet I felt no comfort in its glow. The deeper I stared into it, the more I realized that what lay beyond was not the familiar world I had longed for. It was another world altogether. The flickering edges of the light began to stretch and distort, revealing images I couldn't comprehend, fractured memories, faces I didn't recognize, and places that twisted, folded in on themselves like a half-remembered dream. I wanted to look away, to turn back, but I couldn't. The pull was too strong. My feet moved of their own accord, drawing me closer to the light, as though I were being pulled by invisible hands. And yet, even as I stepped forward, the thought whispered in the back of my mind, what will I find there? Would I finally understand what had happened to Madrid? To the city that no longer seemed to be a city at all? Would the truth be waiting for me on the other side of that blinding glow? Or would it be another trap? Another illusion designed to twist me further into the labyrinth of madness that had become my life? The air around me grew thicker, as if the city itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. The walls, which had once appeared to be made of stone, now seemed to pulse with something else, something alive. I could almost hear it beneath the surface, the slow, rhythmic beat of a heart that wasn't my own. I reached the edge of the light. The warmth enveloped me, seeping into my skin, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt something other than fear. I felt a strange kind of peace, but that peace came with a price. The moment my body crossed into the light, I felt a shift. The air crackled with tension, and I knew that something fundamental had changed. And then I heard it, the sound of voices. At first, they were distant like an echo from far away. But then they grew clearer, more distinct, and I could make out the words. They were not words I recognized, not in any language I had ever known. Yet somehow, they felt familiar, as though I had heard them all my life, and only now was I beginning to understand. It begins now. You are the chosen one. The city will remember. The voices swirled around me, growing louder with each passing second. And then they stopped. Everything stopped. A silence so profound that it pressed in on me from every direction, suffocating me. The light flickered, and I realized with a start that I was no longer standing in the labyrinthine streets of Madrid. I was somewhere else, somewhere far darker. I blinked, and suddenly the world around me was different. The light had faded, leaving me in a cold, dimly lit room. Bare stone walls, a ceiling that stretched far too high, and floors that groaned beneath my weight. I was no longer surrounded by the twisted versions of the city, no longer trapped within its suffocating grip. But what had replaced it was worse. A place where nothing was as it seemed, a realm of shifting shadows and half-formed shapes that seemed to watch me from every corner. The walls themselves seemed to whisper, "No, speak." They carried the same voices from before, only now they were clearer, more distinct. "Welcome to the truth," one of them whispered. "Here, you will understand what Madrid has always been." The air around me vibrated as the city's secrets began to unfurl. And in that moment, I knew. I had entered the heart of Madrid, not the city of lights and life that had once existed, but its core, the dark, forgotten place that had been hidden beneath the surface for centuries. This was the truth I had been chasing, the reality that had always been just out of reach. But the truth came with a price. And now, I understood that I was never meant to escape. As the heavy silence engulfed me, I struggled to find my footing in this new, distorted reality. The walls seemed to breathe, their rough surfaces shifting with each whispered word. The voices no longer echoed. They emanated from everywhere, from within me, from the very air I breathed. They were not just sounds, but feelings, sensations that pried at the deepest corners of my mind, pulling out memories I had long buried. Do you remember? The voice was not a single one, but an endless chorus that seemed to multiply the longer I stood in the heart of this place. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my mouth was dry, and the words tangled in my throat. Every part of me screamed for release, for clarity, but the more I fought against it, the more the city, no, the heart of Madrid, seemed to respond with renewed force. It was as if the city itself was alive, breathing through me, forcing me to confront the truth. I stumbled forward, my eyes darting around in search of something, anything that could explain this new world. The dim lighting cast long, twisted shadows across the floor, but nothing seemed real. The stone beneath my feet felt more like a living, pulsing thing than an inanimate surface. It was as though the very soul of Madrid had begun to leak through the cracks of reality, spilling its ancient secrets into the present. And those secrets were not meant to be uncovered. In the distance, I saw a faint shape, a figure shrouded in shadow, standing motionless. It was almost impossible to tell if it was a person or some kind of reflection, but there was something undeniably human about it. I took a hesitant step forward, and as I did, the figure shifted, becoming clearer. It was me. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but the more I stared, the clearer it became. There, in the shadows, stood a reflection of myself, but it wasn't me. It was a version of myself I had never known, older, tired, hollowed out by time. The eyes, once full of life, were now empty, reflecting nothing but the darkness around us. "Do you remember who you were?" The voice echoed again, and I felt it not just in my mind, but in my very soul. This was no longer just an external force. It was me, a version of me that had somehow been separated from the present, a fragment of a past I could barely grasp. With trembling hands, I reached out to touch the figure, and as I did, the shadowy reflection mirrored my movements. But it wasn't just a mirror, it was alive. The moment our hands met, a surge of memories flooded my mind, memories of a life I had never lived. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as though they were trying to tell me something buried deep within the core of this twisted world. "You were part of it," the voices murmured. "You were always part of it." The realization hit me like a wave, knocking the breath from my lungs. I wasn't just a visitor here. I was a part of this city's curse. Somehow, I had always been tied to Madrid. Not as a wanderer, but as someone who had been woven into its very fabric, a part of its forgotten history. The city had called me here, had brought me back to where it all began. In that instant, the world around me shifted again, and I saw the streets of Madrid as they had once been, a vibrant, bustling place full of life, light, and sound. But as I looked closer, I saw the cracks beneath the surface, the rot that had always existed, hidden from view. The shadows had always been there, waiting to consume everything in their path. And I, too, had been part of that darkness, part of the city's soul. "The city remembers," the voice whispered again. "You were always meant to return." I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth. It was too much to bear. The life I thought I had known, the reality I had clung to, was nothing more than an illusion, a fragment of the truth I had hidden from myself. The true Madrid was not the one I had seen, not the one I had loved. The true Madrid was something far darker, something eternal that had always existed beneath the surface. A city that never dies, only waits. And now it was calling me back. The figure before me, my reflection, stretched out a hand, and I could feel its pull, its cold embrace. I knew I had no choice but to answer it. This was my fate. It had always been my fate, to be part of this forgotten city, to be one of the forgotten souls who wandered its streets, trapped in an endless cycle of shadows and whispers. I had come here seeking answers, but the truth, as I had learned, was far more horrifying than I had ever imagined. As the figure's hand reached toward me, I recoiled instinctively. The coldness of its touch seemed to seep into my bones, and for a moment, I wondered if I had made a grave mistake by stepping into this world. But there was no turning back now. The reflection of myself in front of me, standing in the shadows, was no longer just a vision. It was a manifestation of my deepest fears and forgotten memories. The very essence of my existence felt as though it was unraveling before me, piece by piece. The city around me seemed to shift again, as if responding to my hesitation. The walls groaned, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight, as though the very land itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. The shadows stretched, undulating like living creatures, and the floor beneath me seemed to pulse with a rhythmic beat. The heartbeat of Madrid, the city that never sleeps, never dies. I took a step forward, my legs shaking beneath me, unsure if I was walking towards salvation or towards some new horror. But the reflection of myself remained, unmoving, staring at me with hollow eyes, as though daring me to understand what it had come to represent. The distance between us seemed to stretch impossibly far. Yet with every step I took, I could feel the pull of the past, drawing me closer. "Do you remember now?" The voice, no longer a chorus, but a single, unified sound echoed through the chamber. Do you understand why you are here? I wanted to scream, to push it all away, but the words stuck in my throat. I did remember. The fragments of my past, buried for so long, were slowly coming back. Faces, places, names I had once known but had forced from my mind for fear of what they represented. I remembered the city, not the streets I had walked, but the deeper, more sinister part of it. The parts no one spoke of, the ones that lurked beneath the surface, hidden by time and secrecy. Madrid never forgets, the voice continued. It always calls back those who are tied to it. You are not the first. You will not be the last. My mind raced as I pieced together the fractured memories. I had come to Madrid seeking something, answers perhaps, or a sense of purpose. But what I had found was far more than I had ever bargained for. The city, it seemed, had been watching me, waiting for me to return to its depths. I had always been a part of it, even if I hadn't known it. And now that I was here, there was no escaping it. In the distance, I heard a sound, a voice calling my name. It was distant, but unmistakable, a voice I recognized but hadn't heard in what felt like years. My heart skipped a beat. It was my mother's voice. Come, child, the voice whispered, filled with longing. It's time to come home. I froze. The memory of my mother, a woman long gone from my life, hit me like a blow to the chest. The last time I had seen her, she had been so full of life, so full of love, always reassuring me that everything would be okay. But I had left her behind, along with everything else I thought I had outgrown. I had fled the city, fled the shadows of Madrid, as though running away would somehow free me. But the truth was, Madrid had never let me go. And now, as the voice of my mother reached out to me, I realized that I had never truly left. I had only hidden from what I was meant to face. I took another step, my body moving on its own, drawn toward the voice, toward the shadows, toward whatever it was that lay hidden beneath the layers of time and memory. The reflection of myself in front of me remained still, but as I got closer, its form began to shift, its features warping and distorting. It was no longer my own face I saw, but the faces of others, people I had known, people I had forgotten, each one wearing an expression of sorrow, of regret, of something far darker. You are part of the curse, the voice whispered again, clearer now. You were always meant to return to us. You were always part of Madrid's story. And Madrid's story is never over. The words echoed through my mind, like an incantation that had been spoken long before I ever set foot on these cursed streets. The city had not just been a place of memory. It had been a place of creation and destruction, a place where lives were lived and lost, where souls were bound and never released. And now I realized I was tied to it all, tied to its history, its pain, its endless cycle of suffering. I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the city's heart, part of the forgotten truth that had remained buried for so long. I turned away from the reflection, the faces that now stared back at me with haunting intensity. There was no escape, not anymore. The past had caught up with me, and the city had claimed me once again. Remember who you are, the voice said, its tone now familiar, as though it had always been inside me. Remember the role you have to play. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know the truth. But the truth had already been revealed, and there was no denying it any longer. I had come to Madrid to find answers, but the answers I had uncovered were far darker than I had ever imagined. The city had never forgotten me, and now I was bound to it forever. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air as I stood in the middle of the room, the echoes of the voice still reverberating in my mind. Madrid had always been more than just a city. It was a living, breathing entity, a place where memories became reality, where the past wasn't just remembered, but reenacted over and over again. As I had learned so painfully in the last chapter of this twisted tale, Madrid never lets go. In that moment, something in me snapped. The numbness I had been trying to maintain, the shield I had built to keep myself distanced from everything that had happened, faltered. I could no longer ignore the pull of the city, the deep-rooted connection that seemed to course through my veins. It was as though every part of me had been leading to this realization, and I could no longer deny the truth. I was not a visitor in Madrid. I was a part of it. As I stood there, feeling the cold air prickle against my skin, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was an unsettling sensation, a presence that was not just physical, but also psychological. The shadows in the corners of the room flickered as though alive, and for a fleeting moment, I could swear I saw faces. The faces of those who had walked these streets before me. It wasn't just the city's past calling to me. It was something far older, something older than Madrid itself. I took a step forward, uncertain of what awaited me in the next corner of this fractured reality. Each movement seemed to draw the city closer, pulling me deeper into its web. The walls of the buildings seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the chest of a sleeping giant. The air thickened, laden with the scent of decay and forgotten dreams. And yet, somewhere beneath the oppressive atmosphere, I could hear something faint, a whisper, a call. I froze. It wasn't the voice I had heard before, the voice of my mother or the one that had spoken of the curse. No, this was something different, a sound that stirred something innate within me, something ancient, something buried beneath the surface of my own memories. The whisper wasn't meant to be understood. It was a warning. Without thinking, I moved toward the sound, my feet moving of their own accord, as though the city itself were guiding me. I passed through a narrow hallway, the faint light of the street lamps outside barely penetrating the gloom inside. Each step was deliberate, as though I were walking in time with the city's heartbeat, as though every sound, every movement, was a reflection of something much older than I had realized. The whisper grew louder as I neared an old, rusted door at the end of the hall. Its frame was warped, and the wood creaked under the pressure of time and neglect. But despite its dilapidated appearance, the door pulsed with an unnatural energy. There was something beyond it, something waiting. The urge to open the door was overpowering, as though I had no choice but to obey the call, to step forward into whatever truth lay behind it. I hesitated only for a moment before my hand reached for the handle, its cold metal sending a shock through my body. The door swung open with an eerie groan, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room I entered was dark, its contents hidden by the layers of dust and decay that had settled over it. But despite the darkness, I could feel the weight of countless eyes upon me. The air was thick with the presence of the unseen. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, I saw it, a mirror. It was large, old, and surrounded by intricate carvings that seemed to depict scenes of suffering and despair. The reflection in the mirror was not what I expected. It was my reflection, yes, but distorted, twisted into a grotesque version of myself, with eyes that no longer held my humanity. Instead, they gleamed with something ancient, something hungry. I approached the mirror, unable to tear my eyes away from the image that had taken root in its depths. And as I did, a voice, familiar, yet not quite my own, spoke from behind me. You are the silent witness, the one who watches but never acts. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the silence of the room, thick and suffocating. The air grew heavier with each passing second, and the oppressive weight of the city seemed to press down on me, making it difficult to breathe. I was being watched not by any human eyes, but by the city itself. It was as if every building, every alley, every piece of architecture was a silent witness to the unfolding drama, waiting for me to make the final choice. I turned back to the mirror, my reflection now moving on its own, mirroring my actions with a sinister delay. The voice, still distant, still lurking, came again. You are not meant to be here, but you will be, because you are part of the story, part of the curse that binds this place. The truth hit me like a physical blow. The realization that I was not an observer of this city's horrors, but a part of them. Madrid was not just a place of secrets. It was a place that fed on its inhabitants, turning them into the stories that lived on after their deaths. And now, as I stood in the presence of the mirror, I understood what I had always been, a witness to the unfolding nightmare, a participant in a play that would never end. My reflection began to smile, a twisted, mocking grin that spread across its face. And as it did, The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, to reach for me, pulling at my very soul. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a window into the heart of the city, and I had crossed the threshold. Madrid was not just watching me anymore. It had claimed me. The night was no longer quiet. The oppressive weight of Madrid's mysteries pressed in on me. The city now nothing more than a labyrinth of secrets and half-remembered histories. I could hear the streets whispering, the wind carrying fragments of lost conversations. The lights of the city flickered in rhythm with my heartbeat, their glow painting shadows that seemed to move with purpose. It felt as if the city itself had come alive, watching, waiting, but for what, I could not yet say. The mirror had changed everything. I had stood in front of it, gazing at a reflection that was not just me, but something far more complex, something I couldn't comprehend. My reflection had not only mocked me, but seemed to promise that my fate was intertwined with the city's own darkness. It was no longer about surviving or escaping Madrid. It was about understanding the city's true nature, something I had failed to grasp before. The realization was clear now. I wasn't the victim of Madrid's curse. I was a part of it. I always had been. I couldn't bring myself to leave the room. The door, once a gateway to escape, now felt like a trap, its threshold holding me in place. The reflection in the mirror still haunted me, its twisted smile now imprinted on my mind. I had become the very thing I feared, the silent witness, condemned to observe the city's twisted history without ever being able to intervene. But what was my role in this tale? The voice that had spoken in the mirror had called me this, a witness. But what did it mean for me to bear witness to this place? In the silence of the room, I realized that the city had been waiting for me to accept my place in its story, and I could feel it shifting. The air grew thicker, colder, and I realized I could no longer just stand by. The curse was not just on the city. It was on me. The longer I stayed, the more I became part of its fabric. My life had always been tethered to these streets, bound by unseen forces, events that had never quite made sense. But now, everything clicked into place, and I felt a deep unease stir within me. I was not free. None of us were. I left the room, almost unwillingly, stepping back into the dimly lit hallway. The whispering had stopped, but the sense of being watched remained. I moved down the corridor, but every step felt like a step deeper into a trap, the walls closing in, tightening around me. The hallway itself had changed. The walls, once just cold plaster, now seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as if the very structure of the building was alive. Madrid was not just a city. It was a living, breathing organism, and I had become a part of it. The street outside was no better. It felt as though the air had thickened, turning the city into a suffocating landscape. The sounds of traffic, the chatter of people, the distant hum of life, they all seemed to fade away. The streets had become unnervingly empty, and the buildings around me loomed with an almost ominous presence. It was as though Madrid had swallowed its inhabitants, leaving only those who had been claimed by its curse to walk its avenues. I couldn't help but feel that I was being drawn towards something. The city had a purpose, one that I still didn't fully understand, but it was clear now that it was shaping me, guiding me toward an end that had been set long before I ever arrived. The streets felt as though they were closing in around me, leading me towards something unseen, something hidden beneath the surface of Madrid's familiar streets. I had been caught in a web, and now there was no escaping it. As I walked, the distant sound of footsteps reached my ears. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty streets. The sound seemed to come from every direction, filling the air around me with a sense of impending doom. I turned, but the street was still empty. Yet, the footsteps continued, as if following me, keeping pace with every step I took. Someone or something was tracking me. The shadows around me seemed to stretch longer, more menacing. The buildings on either side felt closer, their windows dark, as though they were watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I tried to shake the feeling of being followed, but the footsteps kept echoing, as if they were getting closer. They were no longer just sounds. They had become a presence, something tangible, moving with me through the streets. At that moment, I realized that I was not alone in the city. The curse that had taken root in me wasn't just about the events that had unfolded. It was about the past. I had ignored it, thinking that the city's history was something to be observed, a relic of another time. But now, the past had come alive, and it was hunting me. I had made the mistake of assuming that Madrid was a city of the present, of history that was confined to the past. But Madrid's true power lay in its ability to bring the past into the present, to make it a part of everything that happened within its walls. I stopped in my tracks, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The footsteps had ceased, but in the stillness that followed, I felt something. The air had shifted. The presence behind me was gone, but I knew it wasn't far. Madrid's past had come alive, and I had become part of its story. The question that lingered was no longer how to escape, but how to survive when the past refuses to stay buried. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as if it were right behind me. The past never leaves, and now it owns you. The words echoed in my mind, and I knew the truth. I was no longer just a witness to Madrid's curse. I had become its keeper. The streets of Madrid had never felt so alien to me. The city, once familiar and full of life, now seemed to hold an inescapable grip on me, as though I had become a part of its very essence. It was not just the people, the buildings, or the streets themselves. It was the air, the weight of it pressing in on my chest, the knowledge that I was now bound to something far older and darker than I had ever understood. I had thought of myself as an observer, someone detached from the chaos and mystery of Madrid's past. But now, I was a keeper of its secrets, and that realization was both terrifying and suffocating. As I walked through the eerily silent streets, my mind was racing. The curse of Madrid was no longer something I could ignore. The mirror, the voice, the strange events, they were all pieces of a puzzle that I was destined to complete. The past, which had once seemed distant and irrelevant, had suddenly become a living, breathing presence in my life. I had become part of its narrative, and now I had to find a way to navigate its labyrinth. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear. This was not simply a case of being haunted by the city's past. No, this was something deeper, something that required a price. The past was not content to remain in the shadows. It wanted to reclaim itself, to force its way into the present, and I was the conduit through which it would manifest. I wasn't just the keeper of Madrid's curse. I was the one who had to face it head-on, to confront the ghost that had been awakened within me. I couldn't help but wonder how many others had walked this path before me. Who were the previous keepers, and how had they met their fates? Were they driven mad? Or did they embrace their role in the city's endless cycle? The thought haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. What was the cost of holding onto Madrid's past? And what would become of me if I failed to fulfill my role? It wasn't just the past that I had to contend with. The city itself had begun to change, subtly at first, but more drastically with each passing day. The weather had turned, with dark clouds lingering over the city even when it should have been clear. The streets were colder, the air thicker, as if the city were wrapping itself in an invisible shroud. Madrid was alive in a way that it had never been before, its pulse beating in time with my own. There were other signs as well, things I had only recently begun to notice. The reflections in windows no longer seemed to be just reflections. They felt like windows into other realities. At times, I would catch glimpses of faces that weren't mine, people I didn't recognize, standing just behind me or in the corner of my vision. When I turned to look, the faces were gone, but the feeling remained. It was as though the city's memories were seeping into the present, its history intertwining with the present in ways that I could no longer separate. It was becoming harder to differentiate between the living and the dead, the past and the present. I began to hear voices in the streets, soft whispers, like the remnants of conversations long since forgotten. They were too faint to make out clearly, but I could feel them, like a constant hum just beneath the surface of reality. The people around me seemed unaware of these strange occurrences, but I wasn't. I knew the truth now. Madrid was a city that never truly let go. It was always watching, always waiting, and now it was pulling me deeper into its web. I stopped in front of a building, one that I had passed by countless times before. There was nothing special about it, yet today it seemed different. The windows stared out at me like eyes, and the door loomed before me, inviting me in. I knew it was a mistake, that crossing that threshold would pull me further into the city's grip, but I couldn't resist. The pull was too strong. As I entered, I was struck by the silence. It was as if the building had been abandoned for years, even though I knew it hadn't. The air inside was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to hum with a low, unearthly vibration. I moved deeper into the building, the creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet the only sound in the oppressive silence. It felt like I was walking through the remnants of a forgotten world, a world that had never fully faded away. And then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it, a mirror, much like the one I had encountered in the previous days. But this one was different. It was larger, more ornate, its surface shimmering with an almost unnatural light. I knew, without a doubt, that this was a mirror from the past, one that had been placed here with intention, a tool to further bind me to the city. But what was its purpose? Was it meant to show me the future, or was it another trap to keep me rooted to the past? I reached for the mirror, my hand trembling as I touched the cool glass. As soon as my fingers made contact, the world around me shifted. The building seemed to disintegrate, its walls melting away into nothingness, replaced by the darkened streets of Madrid, but not the streets I knew. These streets were older, decayed, a shadow of the city I had walked just moments before. And standing in front of me was a figure, a man dressed in old, tattered clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't speak, but his presence was heavy, oppressive. It was as though he had been waiting for me to find my way to this moment. The air around us crackled with energy, the tension palpable. He raised his hand, pointing directly at me. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and I could hear his voice in my mind. "You have come too far," he whispered. "There is no turning back now. The past owns you." I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in this twisted reality. I could feel the weight of Madrid's curse bearing down on me, tightening its grip with each passing second. And then, with a sudden jolt, I was pulled back to the present, standing once again in the dusty building. The mirror before me was dark, its surface blank. Had it all been a vision, a glimpse of the past? Or had it been something more? I didn't know. But I did know one thing for certain. I was no longer just a keeper of Madrid's curse. I had become its prisoner. The city had become a prison. At first, I thought I had simply misinterpreted the events around me. Perhaps it was the stress, the isolation, or simply the bizarre nature of the circumstances I had found myself in. But now, standing in the middle of Madrid's heart, the weight of the city's secrets pressed against me with an unyielding force. There was no mistaking it. I was trapped, and the city was its keeper. The air was heavier, the days felt longer, and even the simple act of walking through the streets felt like an expedition through a land that was foreign yet familiar, haunted by memories that weren't my own. I could still hear the voices from the night before, the whispers in the air, lingering in my thoughts like an insistent hum. It wasn't paranoia. No, I could sense their presence, everywhere. The people around me went about their lives, but it was as if they were walking through a world that didn't fully exist. They were walking in a shadow of reality, one that was crafted long ago, perhaps before they even knew they were part of it. This city was alive with memories, and those memories sought to claim the future, to rewrite history through the thread of each soul that passed through it. What terrified me most was the mirror. That damn mirror. I had hoped that the vision, the strange figure who had spoken to me with such authority, was just another manifestation of my mind breaking down. But no, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the city was trying to communicate with me. The man in the mirror had been a symbol, a warning, and perhaps even a guide. His words had echoed in my mind. "You have come too far. There is no turning back now." The past owns you. The weight of those words was suffocating. The past owns you. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a decree. It had begun to dawn on me that everything I had been experiencing, the whispers, the shifting reality, the feeling of being watched, was tied to something much older than I could comprehend. Madrid, I realized, was not just a city. It was a vessel filled with centuries of blood, pain, and forgotten stories. Those stories needed to be told, needed to be heard, and I was the one they had chosen to hear them. The curse was not just a force haunting me. It was something I had to carry, a weight that would follow me until the end of my days. It wasn't just the spiritual force of the city that terrified me. It was the way the city itself was shifting. The streets were no longer the same. Buildings that had once seemed solid now loomed unnervingly, their architecture distorting, warping into shapes that didn't quite make sense. The sky, too, had changed. What had once been a familiar blue was now a pale, sickly yellow, like an impending storm, the sun hanging in the sky as if suspended in time. The boundaries of the city felt less defined, as if it were shifting in and out of parallel realities. I walked down streets that I knew well, yet they felt unfamiliar, as though I had never walked them before. The landmarks had changed, the shadows longer, darker. It was on one of these walks that I came across a peculiar building, a building I had never seen before, despite its proximity to places I visited regularly. It stood there, hidden in plain sight, as if it had always been part of Madrid's fabric, waiting for me to discover it. The door was ajar, beckoning me inside, and I had no choice but to answer its call. Something in the back of my mind told me that this was the next step in my journey, that this place held the answers I so desperately sought. I entered the building cautiously. The inside was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But there was something different about this place. The walls were covered with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Some were ancient, others more modern, but they all shared a common theme, a connection to the past, to the city's forgotten history. There were paintings on the walls, faded and cracked with age, depicting scenes of Madrid from centuries ago. But as I examined them more closely, I realized they were not simply historical representations. They were memories, frozen in time, suspended within the walls like ghosts waiting to be set free. In the center of the room stood an old desk, and on it, a stack of papers. The papers were yellowed with age, their edges frayed as if they had been handled countless times. I felt compelled to approach the desk, drawn by some invisible force. I picked up the top page, and as I did, the world seemed to shift around me. The room stretched, the walls became distant, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. It was as though the very structure of reality had bent, and I was no longer in the present, but in another time, another layer of the city's endless history. The paper in my hand was a journal entry, the handwriting scrawled in an elegant yet frantic style. It was dated over a century ago, but the words were chillingly familiar. I have been chosen. I hear the whispers at night, the voices from the past calling to me, telling me what must be done. The city will not let go, and neither will I. I must take my place in its story, as its keeper, its eternal keeper. There is no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized that the journal's writer had been another keeper, someone who had been bound to Madrid in the same way I had. And now, their fate was mine to face. As I read on, I understood. The keeper was not a protector, as I had once hoped. The keeper was a prisoner. The city didn't need a protector. It needed a vessel to carry its memories, to hold its curse, to keep its endless cycle alive. The more I read, the more the room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an overwhelming presence that seemed to whisper directly in my ear. I had become what I feared most, a part of the city's unbroken cycle. There was no turning back, no escape. Madrid had claimed me, and it was now my responsibility to keep its secrets, to ensure that its dark history remained undisturbed. The journal's last entry was the most chilling of all. You will understand when the time comes. And when it does, you will no longer be you. I dropped the journal, my heart pounding, I could feel the walls closing in around me, the weight of the city's past pressing down on me like a suffocating cloud. Madrid had not simply claimed me, it had absorbed me. I was no longer a part of the world outside. I was part of the city's unseen machinery, destined to play my role, whether I wanted to or not. I stumbled back out into the streets, feeling the weight of the city pressing down on me. It was as though the very ground beneath my feet had changed, the city's pulse now synchronized with my own. There was no escape. Not anymore. Madrid had me in its grasp, and I had become just another piece in its endless puzzle. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. I had become part of the machine, an unwitting cog in the vast, silent system that Madrid had built around itself. The truth that I was not just a visitor, but a participant, no, a prisoner, was something I could not shake off. It was as if the city had laid claim to my very soul, and every step I took from that point on felt like I was sinking deeper into a web I could neither understand nor escape. I wandered the streets in a trance-like state, the familiar places now feeling alien, as if the past had been rewritten around me, and my memories had been subtly altered. The streets I had once known so well seemed to shift with every turn. Buildings no longer aligned with their positions in my mind, and the air around me grew thick, charged with a presence I could not name. The city's pulse thrummed beneath my feet, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to speak to me, drawing me toward the heart of Madrid. Yet even as I walked, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of detachment. The people I passed seemed like actors playing roles they didn't fully understand. I could hear their voices, but it was as though they were speaking through a veil, distant, muffled, not truly reaching me. My every movement felt guided by forces beyond my control. I tried to shake the feeling, to convince myself that this was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was simply overwhelmed. But the truth became inescapable. Madrid had a grip on me, and I could feel its eyes upon me, watching, waiting. It was then that I noticed something disturbing: the shadows. The shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, curling like tendrils in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought I had simply imagined them, a byproduct of my mind unraveling under the weight of the city's curse. But no, the shadows were real. They moved independently of their source, a dark reflection of the reality I was now trapped in. I tried to ignore them, but they followed me, lurking just out of sight, flickering at the edges of my vision. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking, but by the time I arrived at a familiar square, I realized I was no longer where I had meant to be. The square was empty, and the buildings that surrounded it were unfamiliar, though their architecture was undeniably Madrid's. I was alone, the streets eerily quiet. I could no longer discern if I had entered another part of the city, or if I had simply stepped into a different layer of reality altogether. Was I seeing the Madrid that everyone else saw, or was I caught in some distorted version of it? I reached into my coat pocket, feeling for the journal I had found in the mysterious building. I had kept it close, as if its pages held some sort of power to guide me or provide answers. But as I pulled it out, I noticed that the pages were blank. The words that had been written there, the haunting entries I had read just hours ago, had disappeared as if they had never been written in the first place. Panic surged within me, and I flipped through the pages frantically, searching for something, anything. But the journal remained empty, its pages silent and unyielding. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? A sudden movement caught my attention, a figure in the distance, standing at the far end of the square. It was a woman, her features obscured by the shadows that clung to the square like an oppressive fog. She seemed to be waiting for me, or perhaps beckoning me closer. As I moved toward her, I could feel the air grow colder, the silence more pronounced. The closer I got, the more I felt as though I were walking through thick, invisible barriers, each step dragging me deeper into a world that was not my own. When I reached her, she didn't speak at first. She only stood there, watching me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. There was something about her presence that seemed so wrong, so out of place, like a shadow in a dream that shouldn't exist but did anyway. Her eyes were empty, hollow voids. And when she finally spoke, her voice was a soft, distant whisper that seemed to echo from a place far beyond the square. "You've come too far, haven't you? You thought you could escape, but you're already too deep. The city has claimed you, and now there is no way out. No one escapes Madrid once it has chosen you." Her words sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I stepped back, stumbling as if the very ground beneath me had given way. But there was nowhere to run. The square, the buildings, the entire city, they were closing in on me, each corner seeming to mock my attempts to flee. The shadows, those twisted shapes that had been following me, now seemed to converge upon the woman, enveloping her in their darkness. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. The woman stepped forward, her movements unervingly smooth, as though she were gliding across the ground. She reached out and placed a cold hand on my arm, sending an electric shock through my body. The touch was like ice, yet I couldn't pull away. I was rooted to the spot, caught in her grip, caught in the city's grip. "You felt it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice now sounding more like a soft murmur in my mind than in my ears. The weight of it, the way the city shifts, how it holds everything in its grasp. "It knows you now, and you know it." Her words struck deep. The city's grip. I had felt it all along, the ever-present weight pressing against my chest, the awareness that something was wrong, that something was not right with Madrid. I had been fooling myself into thinking it was just paranoia, just the strain of the situation, but now I knew. It was Madrid itself, bending reality, reshaping the world around me. Her face shifted then, the darkness swirling around her features until she was no longer human, but a twisted reflection of something ancient. Her eyes turned black, her skin became translucent, and I could see through her, as though she were a phantom, a fragment of the city's history. Her smile was unervingly wide, a grotesque expression of glee, and her voice now rang out like a chorus of whispers. "You are the keeper now. The city has claimed you, and you will carry its secrets for as long as it takes." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows swallowed her whole, and in that moment, I understood there was no escape. Madrid had consumed me, and now I was bound to its secrets, its dark history, forever. The woman's words echoed in my mind as I felt the city's pulse quicken, the boundaries of reality thinning with each passing moment. Madrid had made its choice, and now I was its prisoner. The following days after that encounter felt like an endless nightmare I couldn't wake from. Each morning I would open my eyes, half expecting the square to be the same, silent and empty, the shadows still lingering at the edges of my vision. Yet, no matter how many times I tried to leave, no matter how many streets I walked, I was trapped in the same labyrinth, the same perpetual loop. Madrid was no longer a city of life, but of something darker, something ancient, holding me within its cold grasp. I began to notice that the people I encountered, those who seemed so real just weeks ago, no longer appeared human. Their faces were blurry, their movements jerky and unnatural. It was as though they were actors, playing roles in a production that I had no part in, yet was forced to witness. Conversations felt like fragments of old scripts, words spoken without meaning, gestures performed out of obligation. Their eyes, however, were the worst. They were vacant, hollow, and whenever they looked at me, I felt a deep unease, as though they could see right through me, into something I wasn't even sure existed. The idea that I had become a part of this shadow world, this grotesque city, was becoming undeniable. I had tried to retrace my steps, searching for the building where I had found a journal, desperate to find some explanation. But every street I took led to places I didn't recognize, or worse, places that didn't seem to exist at all. There were times when I would turn a corner, only to find that the street had morphed into something unrecognizable, with buildings that weren't there before or alleyways that twisted in impossible directions. I was caught in a city that was alive, but it wasn't alive in the way that I understood. The woman, the twisted figure from the square, had left me with a deep sense of dread, and I couldn't rid myself of her words. "The city has claimed you, and you know it?" They echoed through my thoughts constantly, as if the city itself were whispering to me through the cracks of reality. I was becoming a part of it, and worse, I was beginning to understand it, to feel its pulse beneath the streets, beneath my skin. The air grew thicker with every passing day, laden with a presence that pressed against me, suffocating me, urging me to accept it, to submit. On the 5th day after the encounter, I stood on the edge of a familiar park, one I had visited countless times before. But this time it felt different. The trees seemed to whisper in the wind, their branches twisting unnaturally, casting shadows that stretched impossibly long. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as though the very earth was rearranging itself to suit the will of the city. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if the city itself was unraveling around me. It was then that I noticed the figure standing at the far end of the park. It wasn't the woman, but someone else, someone I hadn't seen before. This person stood still, facing away from me, the wind rustling through their dark hair. Their clothes were old-fashioned, as though they didn't belong in this time. But what struck me the most was the air of familiarity that hung around them. I had never seen this person before, but deep inside I knew them. I knew who they were. I approached cautiously, my feet dragging as if I were walking through molasses. The closer I got, the more my heart raced. There was something undeniably unsettling about this person. They turned slowly to face me, and as they did, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The person's eyes were filled with an ancient sorrow, as though they had seen things, horrible things, that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. Their face was gaunt, their skin pale, as if they had been touched by the same darkness that seemed to haunt this city. "You're finally here," the figure said, their voice a soft, sorrowful whisper that barely reached my ears. "You've been searching for answers, haven't you? But there are no answers to be found. Only the truth." I stood frozen, unable to speak, my mind reeling. The figure stepped closer, and with each step, I could feel the weight of the city pressing in on me. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthening around us. I felt it, the truth she spoke of. It was a truth that had been there all along, hiding beneath the surface, waiting for me to see it, to embrace it. "You're part of the city now," she continued, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own racing heartbeat. "You always have been. From the moment you stepped into Madrid, you became a piece of its history, its dark history. And now, there's no turning back." The words hit me like a tidal wave. I had always believed I was an outsider, just passing through, a visitor in a foreign land. But now, the truth was undeniable. Madrid wasn't just a city. It was a living entity, an ancient force that had been quietly devouring its inhabitants for centuries. And I too had been consumed by it. The shadows, the strange occurrences, the unnatural movements of the people. They weren't just figments of my imagination. They were the city's doing, the way it reshaped itself, the way it twisted the world around me to fit its dark purpose. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but there was no escape. The figure's eyes bored into me, seeing into the deepest parts of my soul. I had become a part of the very fabric of Madrid. It had taken me in, and now there was nothing left of me. My memories, my identity, they were being slowly erased, replaced with the city's own. It was happening, and I couldn't stop it. "You'll understand soon enough," the figure whispered, stepping back into the shadows. "The city chooses those who belong, and now that you've been chosen, there's no escape. You'll become part of its story, just like all the others." As the figure disappeared into the night, the reality of it all finally settled in. Madrid was not just a city. It was a force, a being that existed beyond time, beyond the laws of nature. And I had become one of its many lost souls, trapped in its endless cycle of creation and destruction. I had once been a visitor, an observer, but now I was a part of its nightmarish history. The truth was inescapable. There was no going back. Madrid had claimed me, and I was never going to leave. The reality of the situation had settled over me like a cold, suffocating shroud. I had spent weeks, months even, trying to unravel the strange events that had been unfolding around me, convinced that there was some explanation, some rational conclusion that would make sense of the madness. But now, standing on the edge of the abyss, I understood. There was no answer, not in the way I had hoped. No neat conclusion, no closure. Madrid wasn't a city. It was something else entirely, a living, breathing entity that had existed far longer than any of us could comprehend. It had woven its web around me, and I had become part of its endless cycle, a mere cog in its eternal machine. I had tried to resist it. I had tried to fight back against the strange pull, the suffocating weight of the city that seemed to bend and shape the world around me. But with each passing day, I felt the city's grip tighten, pulling me deeper into its web. The streets no longer held the familiarity they once did. Each corner I turned felt like I was stepping into a new version of Madrid, one that was ever-changing, always shifting, as if the city itself were rewriting its own history to fit the narrative it wanted. The faces of the people had become blank slates, expressions frozen in time, as though they had all been sculpted from the same mold, bound by the same sinister force that held me captive. In the hours when I was alone, I could feel the city watching me. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, its whispers in the wind, its pull in every crack and crevice. I had become a part of the story. The truth, as horrifying as it was, had settled into my bones. I wasn't just living in Madrid. I was becoming a part of it, a piece of its dark legacy. The people, the buildings, the very streets themselves were all part of a greater design. A design I had unknowingly stepped into, and now there was no escaping it. The woman's words echoed in my mind. "You're part of the city now." At first, I had thought them to be some form of cryptic madness, an attempt to torment me. But now, they made perfect sense. I had never truly belonged here. I had been a visitor, an outsider who had wandered into a world beyond my understanding. And now, that world had consumed me. I had been drawn into a cycle that had existed long before I arrived, and would continue long after I was gone. The city was eternal. It existed on its own timeline, one that didn't adhere to the rules of the human world. Time here was fluid, stretching and contracting at the whims of the city, erasing all who dared challenge its grip. As the days passed, the changes became more apparent. I could feel the transformation within myself, like something ancient and dark was beginning to rise from deep within. The boundaries between who I had been and what I was becoming began to blur. Memories, once vivid and sharp, began to fade. Faces of people I had known, places I had visited, all of it started to slip through my fingers like sand. The more I struggled to hold on to these remnants of my former life, the more they disintegrated, lost to the city's all-consuming grasp. The lines between dream and reality had long since disappeared. What had once seemed like an objective truth now felt distant and intangible, as though it belonged to someone else, someone who had never truly existed. But there were moments, fleeting though they were, when I felt a surge of clarity. I would stand in the middle of the street in the heart of the city, and I would hear a voice in my mind, a voice that wasn't my own. It was the voice of the city itself, speaking to me, guiding me, pulling me deeper into its eternal cycle. I would see flashes of the past, glimpses of people who had once walked these streets, lost souls, each one swallowed up by the city's insatiable hunger. They were all gone now, replaced by new faces, new stories to be rewritten. And I, too, would eventually fade, a forgotten memory, a whisper in the wind. The horror of it all lay in the realization that I was no different from the others. I wasn't unique, not special, not even an anomaly. I had been chosen, yes, but not in the way I had hoped. I had been chosen because I was just another piece in the city's endless game. There was no final escape, no great revelation that would set me free. The city had claimed me, and I would be part of its story forever. It wasn't just about physical location anymore. The city's influence had seeped into my very soul. I could feel it in the way my thoughts moved, in the way my emotions twisted. I was no longer merely existing in Madrid. I was becoming Madrid. My memories, my identity were being rewritten by the city, transformed into something that would fit into the larger narrative. I could feel my humanity slipping away, replaced by something darker, something colder. But even in this transformation, there was no fear, no resistance. There was only acceptance. Acceptance that this was my fate. Acceptance that this was my role to play. The people who still walked the streets with me, they were all part of it too. They were the city's puppets, just as I had become. Their eyes, too, were empty now, vacant, reflecting the same hollow existence that I had embraced. They were trapped in the same eternal cycle, each one a fragment of a much larger story that would continue for centuries, for millennia, long after we were gone. The city was eternal. It was always there, waiting, watching, consuming, rewriting its own history with every passing moment. And so, as I stand here now, in this place that no longer feels real, I am not sure what is left of me. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps I am just another figment of Madrid's imagination, a lost soul caught in the web of time. But I know one thing for certain. I am here, and I always will be. In the streets, in the buildings, in the memories of those who walk these streets, I am part of it. And Madrid will continue, just as it always has. The cycle will never end. It has consumed me, as it has consumed all those before me, and it will consume those who come after. And in the end, there is nothing left but the city, endless, eternal, waiting for its next visitor to claim.